Today's class is Healthy Shopping. We will be looking at how to read and use the nutrition labels that we find on food products to guide us in our decisions when we are grocery shopping. We will be looking at the entire nutrition label, and we will be focusing on the nutrients that are especially important for us as cardiac patients. The nutrition label that we see today on our food packaging first came about in the 1990s following the passing of the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act of 1993. They brought this law out in the 90s because there was a movement towards more packaged foods, and they wanted to have similar nutrition information available on all food items, specifically packaged food items. This similar nutrition information makes it easier for consumers to compare products because they have the same information on each product to look at. The label stayed the same for quite a long time, but in 2016 it had its first major revision. So if you've been looking at nutrition labels for a while, you may have noticed that there are some slight changes. The revision came out in 2016, but the government gave food manufacturers quite a while to make the change in the nutrition label. They were originally given a deadline in 2018, but it seemed like it was a little difficult for food manufacturers to complete it by that time frame, and the government did give them an extension until January 1st, 2020. So as of right now, we should be seeing the new nutrition label in most of the foods we look at. Food manufacturers that have smaller production, if they have less than $10 million in annual sales, they were given an additional year to get the new nutrition label on their packaging. So we still may be seeing the original nutrition label in some items. For today's class, we will be looking at the new nutrition label, and I'll point out some of the changes that were made as we go along. Most foods that we look at in the grocery store will have the nutrition label. However, there are some foods that are not required to have the nutrition label printed on them. These would be things like coffee or spices that don't provide any significant nutrients. If we look at dried oregano or ground coffee beans, they don't have any significant calories or sodium or fats, and so they are not required to have a nutrition label. You may have noticed that some spice blends will have a nutrition label, and that is because spice blends often use salt as an ingredient. Since salt provides sodium, they would then have to have a nutrition label to identify the amount of sodium in that spice blend. Foods that are prepared in the grocery store and are ready to eat. So for example, cupcakes in the bakery, or chicken salad that's been prepared by the deli. Those things don't require a nutrition label. Nutrition labels are voluntary for raw fruits and vegetables. Mostly this is because it's hard to print a nutrition label on the side of an apple. But even if raw fruits and vegetables are packaged, such as bagged spinach or lettuce mixes, they may or may not have a nutrition label because it's voluntary and the manufacturer can choose to include the label or to leave it off. And for meats that are packaged in the grocery store, whether they're ground and packaged or prepared into patties and packaged, they may not have nutrition information on their packaging as well. Sometimes stores do include some nutrition information, but it often does not look like the nutrition label that we're used to seeing. Let's look at some nutrition information for the foods that may not have a nutrition label, such as fruits and vegetables. In general, the produce department of the grocery store is one of the safest places for us to do our shopping. Raw fruits and vegetables tend to be very low calorie density, but provide a lot of nutrients. They also tend to be very low in sodium and fats and saturated fats, making them a great choice for us on a heart-healthy diet. Non-starchy vegetables are our lowest calorie density food group, providing about 25 calories per cup of raw non-starchy vegetable. For example, bags of spinach. If you've ever looked at the nutrition label on a bag of spinach, you may have noticed there's about 35 calories per serving. But the serving is the entire bag of spinach. This is a great example of a very low calorie density food that happens to be very nutrient dense, provides a lot of vitamins and minerals for a very small amount of calories. Fruit has a little bit higher calorie density because it has more natural sugar. That's why fruit tastes sweet, because of its natural sugar content. So fruit provides about 60 calories per small serving, or a half a cup of chopped fruit. A small serving would be about the size of a tennis ball or a woman's fist. Starchy vegetables, which would be your sweet potatoes, your white potatoes, your corn, and your peas, provide a little bit more calories because of their starch content at about 120 calories per cup. In the meat department, there's going to be a variation on the calorie content based on the fat content of the meat. All meats are some combination of fat grams and protein grams. So a very lean meat, such as a skinless chicken breast, is mostly made up of grams of protein with maybe 1 gram of fat. And each gram of protein provides 4 calories, and each gram of fat provides 9 calories. So when a meat is made up mostly of grams of protein with very little fat, it will also be lower in calories. So a 3-ounce portion of that skinless white meat chicken breast, about the size of a deck of cards, would only provide about 105 calories. When we look at higher fat meats, such as a bratwurst or sausage, these meats have a higher fat content, and at 9 calories a gram of fat, that higher fat content creates a higher calorie content per ounce. So that same portion size, 3 ounces, or about a deck of cards, of a high-fat meat like a bratwurst would actually provide 300 calories as opposed to that 105 calories for the lean meat. Here is an example of a nutrition facts label. In today's class, we're going to go through the label and look at each section, starting with the serving size, also looking at the calories, and then the nutrients that are listed under the calories. Some of these nutrients we may be trying to limit, such as sodium, saturated fat, or trans fats. Other nutrients on the label we're trying to make sure we're getting enough of, such as the nutrients down at the bottom, vitamin D and calcium. These are vitamins and minerals that are important for nutrition and important to prevent certain diseases. So we may be trying to get enough of these nutrients throughout the day. We'll also take a look at the percentages on the side of the label. These are the percent daily values. They're a little bit harder to understand, so we'll be taking a look at those today as well. When looking at the nutrition label, one of the first places we want to look is at the serving size. This is at the top of the label, and all of the other nutrition information on the label is based on what the manufacturer calls a serving, not necessarily on what you're planning on eating. We may be planning on eating more or less than what they consider a serving of that food. And in that case, we would have to adjust the nutrition information based on what we're actually going to eat. The serving sizes on the nutrition label are standardized for similar products, which means all peanut butters are based on a specific serving size, 2 tablespoons. All soups are based on a specific serving size for soup, which is 1 cup. All ice creams are based on 2/3 of a cup. And this makes it easier to compare products. It would be much more difficult to compare the nutrition information for ice creams if one label was based on 1/2 a cup and one label was based on 2/3 of a cup. So those standardized serving sizes are helpful. Now, I have had a patient ask me before if I thought those standardized serving sizes were unrealistically small, and my answer is no. I think our perception of portion sizes has gotten unrealistically large over time. Part of this is related to the fact that restaurant portions have increased dramatically over the years, and we've gotten used to those large portions. So if you're struggling with portion control, or if that's something you're wanting to work on, those serving sizes listed on nutrition labels are a great place to start and can help show you what is an appropriate amount of food. A change you may have noticed on the nutrition label with the new label is this dual column format label that you see on your slide. This is used in a package of food that has more than one serving in it, but less than 3 servings. And it's likely that the consumer will eat all of the contents of the package in one setting. So an example of this would be, say, a bag of pretzels or chips that you would buy at the convenience store. They have more than one serving, but it's not the full-size bag. And it's likely the consumer will eat all of the package at one time. In that situation, the manufacturer is supposed to use a dual column format that lists the nutrition information per serving and then multiplies it out and provides the nutrition information per the entire container. This is helpful because they're doing the math for us, but it's also helpful because it draws the consumer's attention to the fact that if they eat the entire package of pretzels, they're consuming more than one serving and alerting them to exactly how much sodium, fat, calories they would actually be consuming. If we choose to eat more than one serving of a food item, let's say we doubled the serving size, then we have to double all of the other information on the nutrition label, the calories, the fat, the sodium, as well as the vitamins and minerals that the food provides. What can happen is the sodium or fats, things that we might be trying to limit, when we double those, they start to add up very quickly when we look at our daily total. To help us follow those standardized serving sizes, it's important to never eat out of a multi-serving bag. Most people have a hard time eating only 9 potato chips when they sit down with the entire bag at one time. This is especially true if we're doing something else while we're eating, such as watching TV or working on our computer. When we're distracted, we may not realize how much of a food we're eating. So some tricks for that is to simply pull out a single portion of whatever it is you're eating and put it into an appropriately sized container. Maybe small bowls that we use for things like nuts or snack foods. That helps us to have only one portion at a time. Then if we decide to have more, we're making a conscious decision to get up and get an additional portion of that snack, versus just mindlessly eating out of a larger bag and not realizing how much of the food we are actually eating. Beneath the serving size, we'll find calorie information. This is information that's very important if weight management is one of our goals. Calories are a measure of how much energy that you will get from a serving of food. And when we think about weight management, energy balance is very important in this. Meaning when I consume energy in the form of calories, I want the amount I consume to be balanced with the amount of calories or energy I'm burning throughout the day with my exercise, my activities of daily living, and my metabolic rate. When the calories in equal the calories out, I will see weight maintenance. When there's an imbalance and I'm consuming more calories than my body's actually using, my body will have to store those calories, and it often stores it in the form of body fat. So if I'm consistently consuming more calories than my body actually uses, I'll tend to see weight gain over time. Now, calorie needs vary from person to person. The nutrition label assumes an average calorie intake of about 2,000 calories a day. But not everybody needs 2,000 calories a day, and some people may need more. The things that affect your calorie needs are gender. Men tend to need more calories than women. Our age. We tend to need more calories when we're younger than when we're older. Our size, both our height and weight, the larger we are, the more calories we tend to burn. And of course, our activity level affects our calorie needs significantly. But when we look at all these factors and we use energy predictive equations, which is a way that I would estimate the number of calories you need in a day, calorie needs tend to fall within about 1,800 to 2,400 calories for most patients. Women, we tend to be at the lower end, maybe 1,800 to 2,000. Men tend to be at the higher, more like 2,000 to 2,400 calories a day. And of course, that's going to vary with activity level quite a bit. But when we look at these average calorie intakes, when we look at a single food item, we can use 400 to 600 calories for a meal being pretty appropriate. For a snack or a single item food, about 100 to 200 calories is considered an appropriate amount of calories. If we eat 3 meals a day and have about 2 snacks throughout the day, then these calorie levels are going to keep us in that target range of about 1,800 to 2,400 calories a day. Below the calorie information, we see nutrients. These are a list of key nutrients that can impact our health. Some of the nutrients on the label, like saturated fat or sodium, we may be limiting to improve our health. Other nutrients on the label, the vitamins and minerals, perhaps the protein, the fiber, are nutrients we're trying to get enough of to maintain our health. The first nutrient listed on the nutrition label is total fat. There are actually 4 types of fats that we find in food. 2 of them are required to be on the nutrition label, where the other 2 types of fats are not required but sometimes appear on the nutrition label. The 2 types of fats that are required are saturated fat and trans fats. The other 2 types are the 2 unsaturated fats, monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. The total of these 4 types of fats are what are included in the total fat column. Now remember, fat provides 9 calories per gram. So any food that has a high fat content, even if it's the good fats versus the bad fats, will tend to be high in calories. An example of this is walnuts. Walnuts are a healthy food. They have a lot of nutrients, and most of their fat content is the good fats, the unsaturated fats. But because of the high fat content, walnuts are very calorically dense. 1/4 of a cup of walnuts has 200 calories in it. So something just to be careful of when we are considering weight management is that foods that are high in total fat will tend to be high in calories. Below the total fat, we will always see saturated fat and trans fats listed. The reason these 2 types of fats are always included on the nutrition label is because these are called the bad fats. They can negatively impact our health. Both saturated fat and trans fats tend to raise our LDL cholesterol levels, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. The other 2 types of fats might appear on the nutrition label, but they are not required. Often they appear on the nutrition label in foods that are high in those unsaturated fats. The manufacturer's wanting to point out that yes, the food is high in fat, but look, it's high in the good fats, the monounsaturated and polyunsaturated. The reason we call these the good fats is because they don't raise cholesterol like the 2 we see listed here. Saturated fat does tend to raise cholesterol levels, so the American Heart Association recommends that we limit our saturated fat content to less than 7% of our total calories. Now that's a little bit of a confusing way to say it. That's a different percentage than you see listed on the nutrition label. So if we look at average calorie intakes and calculate less than 7%, and convert that to actual grams of saturated fat, because that's how we see it listed on the nutrition label, it calculates out to be about 12 to 15 grams of saturated fat allowed in a heart-healthy diet per day. Now our total fat content may be close to 78 grams for the whole day, but we only want about 12 to 15 of those grams to come from saturated fat. trans fats are actually worse for us than saturated fat because not only do they raise the LDL, that bad cholesterol in our blood, they also lower the HDL or good cholesterol levels. Trans fats we want to avoid if at all possible, which means 0 grams of trans fat per day. The good news is it's easier to do that today than it was in years past. In years past, we found a lot of trans fats in food in the form of partially hydrogenated oils. We've probably heard that word before or seen it listed on ingredient lists. These were artificial fats, fats that went through a hydrogenation process to change their texture or to make them more shelf stable. But that process of hydrogenation created artificial trans fats. So back in 2018, the FDA banned partially hydrogenated oils in our food. And when they did that, they basically removed almost all trans fats from our foods. Some trans fats do occur naturally in beef products, so it is possible that you will see small amounts in higher fat cuts of beef. But in general, most of the time, that trans fat on the nutrition label should say 0 grams. Let's look at where we're going to find the saturated and trans fats in the grocery store. Any food that has fat in it will likely have both saturated and unsaturated fats. But certain foods will have much more of the saturated fat and other foods will have more of the unsaturated fat. The general rule is if fat comes from an animal product, it will tend to be higher in saturated fat. Where if fat comes from a plant product, it will tend to be higher in the unsaturated fats. Now there are 2 exceptions to that rule, and I'll get to those in a minute. But when we're looking at foods in the grocery store that come from an animal, they may have a lot of saturated fat. So we want to try to choose the leanest animal products or the lowest fat animal products. For example, meats. When we think about our meat selection in the grocery store, our leanest meats tend to be our skinless white meat poultry, whether that's chicken or turkey. Those tend to be very low in overall fat and would have very little saturated fat, about 1/2 gram of saturated fat in a skinless chicken breast. Beef and pork tend to have more overall fat and would therefore have more saturated fat. So a trick we can do there in the grocery store is to look for the word loin. The loin is the leaner part of both the cow and the pig. So cuts of meat that come from the loin part of the animal tend to have less overall fat and less saturated fat. Examples would be ground sirloin, pork tenderloin, boneless loin chops. Those things would be lower in overall fat. So for example, when we think about what would provide 12 to 15 grams of saturated fat, if I'm looking at purchasing beef and I pick up that ground chuck, which is the 80-20, 80% lean, 20% fat, 4-ounce serving of ground chuck would have about 10 grams of saturated fat, where the 4-ounce serving of my ground sirloin would only have about 3.5 grams of saturated fat. So with a daily limit of 12 to 15 grams for the whole day, 10 gram serving isn't going to fit very easily into that limit, but a 3 to 5 gram serving may fit depending on what else I eat in the day. Now that skinless white meat poultry had about 1/2 gram of saturated fat and would fit much easier than either of the beef choices. But if we're going to choose beef or pork, looking for that word loin is what we can look for in the grocery store. Now there is one animal product that breaks this rule, and that's fish. When fish is naturally high in fat, it is not high in saturated fat, it's high in the polyunsaturated fat omega-3. We've heard of omega-3 fatty acids before. We know these are good for us. There's a lot of research behind these as being potentially heart healthy and help to reduce our risk of death from cardiovascular disease. And we find omega-3s in the highest quantities in our fatty fish. So when we're looking at the grocery store, fatty fish like salmon or ahi tuna, mackerel, herring. These things have a lot of natural fat content, but they're high in the unsaturated fats. Other animal products in the grocery store that tend to have a lot of saturated fat is high-fat dairy. So when we're looking at dairy, we want to look for lower fat versions. So we want to choose skim milk or 1% milk instead of 2% or whole. 2% or whole milk will simply have a little bit more saturated fat in them. For example, a cup of whole milk has 5 grams of saturated fat, where skim milk would have 0. 1% milk would have about 1.5 grams of saturated fat. Remember, our daily limit is 12 to 15 grams. So each of these places, if we can choose a product that's lower in saturated fat, it's going to make it easier for us to stay within that daily limit. Cheese is an area of dairy that tends to be high in fat. So again, we can look for cheeses that are made with part skim milk, like part skim mozzarella. Some of the 2% cheeses will be a little bit lower in fat and be a little bit lower in saturated fat. Another trick we can do with cheese is to look for ultra thin slices of cheese in the grocery store. So if we compare nutrition labels for our cheese slices, the thick slices have about 6 grams of saturated fat per one slice, where the ultra thin slices would have about 6 grams of saturated fat for 3 slices. So if I only use one slice of that ultra thin cheese, I only get about 2 grams of saturated fat, which again is going to fit easier into my daily limit. Butter is another source of saturated fat in the grocery store. It has about 7 grams per tablespoon. So our plant-based spreads, like a Smart Balance or Brummel & Brown, those are 2 examples that I've recommended. They tend to be made with plant-based oils. So they tend to be lower in saturated fat and can be used without making as big of a contribution to our daily saturated fat intake. Plant fats tend to be higher in the unsaturated fat, so fats that come from plant-based oils like olive oil, canola oil, grapeseed oil. These tend to be very high in the mono and poly unsaturated fats. They still have some saturated fat, but it's a very, very small amount, maybe 1 gram of saturated fat in about a tablespoon of these oils. Products that are made from these oils, like mayonnaises or salad dressings, will also be lower in saturated fat but higher in the unsaturated fats. Nuts and avocados are also plant-based fats that tend to be higher in the good fats and lower in the bad saturated fat. Now there is an exception with our plants as well. Tropical oils. This would be your coconut oil, your palm oil, and your palm kernel oil. Even though they're a plant product, they are particularly high in saturated fat. So the American Heart Association does not recommend the regular use of any of these tropical oils. And I always mention that because coconut oil tends to be very popular. And it does have some possible health benefits that relate to its chemical structure, its being a medium chain triglyceride. However, when the American Heart Association looked at studies to see the effect of coconut oil on the concentration of LDL particles in the blood, they saw that the saturated fat from coconut oil did increase LDL concentrations, so they do not recommend the regular use of it. Palm oil and palm kernel oil are not something we would have in our kitchen to cook with, but we do see these in processed snack foods. Remember when I said that manufacturers can no longer use partially hydrogenated oils? Well, a lot of them replace those with palm oil. So foods that are processed snack foods, like a Little Debbie snack cake, for example, isn't an animal food. We wouldn't think of it as high in saturated fat from an animal product, but because of its use of palm oil or other fully hydrogenated oils, they would also be a significant source of saturated fat, along with a lot of processed baked goods. Of course, these will have a nutrition label, so we can always look at the label to see the actual grams of saturated fat. Remember, trans fats, we previously saw these in vegetable shortenings, hard stick margarines, and processed snack foods, but because they have partially hydrogenated oils have been banned, we typically see 0 grams of trans fats in most foods. Another nutrient on the nutrition label that we should be focusing on as heart patients is the sodium content of food. I once had a patient come sit in my office and say the first time he went grocery shopping after his heart attack, he left the store with nothing in complete disgust. He was very frustrated. He thought it had to have 0 milligrams of sodium in order for him to be able to eat it. And the reality is, you won't find very many foods that have 0 milligrams of sodium. Sodium occurs naturally in a lot of foods. Just like it occurs in your body, it occurs in the body of a cow or a chicken. So beef and eggs, milk and cheese, all of these things will have sodium in them. Even some vegetables, like a stalk of celery, has some naturally occurring sodium in it. So we can't avoid it completely. In fact, you don't want to avoid sodium completely. We need sodium every day. It's an essential nutrient that's important for cellular function. What we want to avoid is excessive amounts of sodium. So the American Heart Association has provided us with 2 recommendations for sodium limits. They recommend no more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day for everyone. And this is actually the same number that the government gives us, the same limit of 2,300 milligrams a day for every healthy American. The American Heart Association also gives us a second number to think about. They recommend 1,500 milligrams or less as being ideal. And this is especially true for patients that have high blood pressure or fluid retention problems like congestive heart failure. Now, when we think about limiting sodium, we have to look at the 3 major sources of excessive sodium. The first one is the salt shaker. A teaspoon of salt has 2,360 milligrams of sodium. So if we're in the habit of adding salt to our food at the table or adding quite a bit when we're cooking, we're not going to be able to stay in those sodium limits very easily. And this is true for all the different types of salt that you see in the grocery store these days. We see regular iodized table salt, but we also see kosher salt or sea salt, Himalayan salt, both pink Himalayan and black Himalayan, a lot of different salt choices. The reality is they're all salt. So they all have sodium. And because sodium occurs naturally in food and it's found in processed foods, there isn't a whole lot of room for us to add a lot of sodium to our foods. So even some of these other types of salt, we still want to avoid adding these to our food in excessive amounts. The second big source of sodium is restaurant foods, and we will spend a whole class talking about that. But the third source is what we're going to see at the grocery store, and this is sodium that's been added by the manufacturer during the processing of a food. About 75% of the sodium that we typically take in doesn't come from the salt shaker, it comes from processed foods. It's in the foods already before we even buy them. Sodium is a preservative, so sodium is added to a lot of foods to promote shelf stability, to allow that lunch meat, that processed deli meat, to sit in our refrigerator for weeks at a time and not go bad. That requires a lot of sodium to prevent bacteria from growing in that lunch meat. Sodium's also added to provide flavor. When you think about processed side dishes like rice-a-roni or packaged flavored noodles, a lot of the flavoring is salt, so those tend to be high in sodium. My general rule when going to the grocery store is if anything has 140 milligrams or less of sodium, that is considered a low sodium food. In fact, according to that Nutrition Label and Education Act, the manufacturer can actually write low sodium food on the front of a package if it meets that requirement. So in general, if a food item has less than 140 milligrams, it's okay to eat. 300 milligrams or more, I want you to leave it at the store. That's my other general rule. Now that means I just left a lot of different food choices at the store. Canned soups, canned entrees like spaghetti or chili, frozen dinners, frozen side dishes, processed meats. A lot of these are greater than 300 milligrams of sodium per serving, and we're definitely going to try to avoid, if not limit, these foods to stay within these sodium recommendations. Now, in between 140 and 300 is kind of a gray area. You're not going to be able to choose very many foods in a day from this list, maybe one in that range of 140 to 300 milligrams, and still stay within those recommended limits. but most foods we want to have less than 140 milligrams per serving. Now remember, fruits have hardly any sodium, about 0 to 5 milligrams. Our vegetables, unless sodium has been added, they usually have less than 35 milligrams per serving. So the more fruits and vegetables we're eating, the easier it's going to be to stay within that sodium limit. If we have diabetes, we are probably already looking at the total carbohydrate listed on the nutrition label because we know that carbohydrates raise our blood glucose levels. But even if we don't have diabetes, we should be paying attention to the sugars that we find in foods. The new nutrition label includes the row that identifies added sugars in addition to the total sugars. The previous label would just list sugars, and we didn't know how many of those sugars came from naturally occurring sources, like the fructose in fruit or the lactose in milk, or if it was sugar that had been put there by the manufacturer, such as sucrose or dextrose or high fructose corn syrup. When we think about natural sugars versus added sugars, it's important to note that when we eat natural sugars, like the sugar that occurs in a bowl of strawberries, I'm also consuming a lot of important nutrients. Strawberries have folic acid and vitamin C and potassium and fiber, along with that naturally occurring sugar. When I look at the nutrition label on a gallon of milk, you'll notice there's about 11 grams of sugar. Nobody poured sugar into that gallon of milk. That's just the lactose that naturally occurs in the milk. And while that's raising my blood sugar, I'm also getting protein and calcium, vitamin D, potassium, and phosphorus when I consume that milk. When I consume sugar from an added sugar source, there usually isn't much important nutrients along with it. For instance, a Coca-Cola has a lot of added sugar and no nutrition, no calcium, no protein, no fiber, no vitamin C, or anything good for me when I consume that added sugar. So the American Heart Association does recommend that we limit our quantity of added sugar for the day. Their recommendations are 36 grams or less of added sugar per day for men, 25 grams or less of added sugar per day for women. And the difference between men and women is based on the fact that as women, we generally need less calories overall, and they're basing that sugar recommendation on a percentage of your calories. Now notice they're limiting added sugars, not total sugars. I'm not as concerned about the sugar that comes from fruit or milk because I know there's other important nutrients. Now if we're diabetic, that natural sugar still raises our blood sugar and we have to count it as part of our total carbohydrate, but we would consider it good carbs, where added sugar that provides little nutrition is what we're trying to limit. So to put 36 grams or 25 grams per day in perspective, it's important to note that 1 teaspoon of sugar has 4 grams of sugar in it. 1 tablespoon of sugar has 12 grams. So if I put a teaspoon of brown sugar in my oatmeal in the morning, that's not that much of a problem, 4 grams, and my daily total is 25. However, if I put sugar in my oatmeal in the morning and I put some in my coffee and I also put a little bit in my tea and I have a granola bar as a snack in the afternoon, I'll probably go over my limit for the day of 25 grams. Sugar is added to a lot of foods by processors to provide palatability. Sugar tastes sweet and it can make food taste good. So a lot of snacks, even snacks that we consider healthier snacks, will still have added sugars. For instance, a Nutri-Grain bar has about 12 grams of added sugar in it. A serving of honey graham crackers has about 8 grams of sugar in it. That's a lot when you think about how quickly it will add up through the day. Now, I'm not saying you can't eat these foods or suggesting they're bad foods for you. I'm just pointing out that added sugars show up in a lot of different foods, and that 25 gram limit or 36 gram limit can be reached very quickly if we're not careful about our food choices. The nutrition label also includes information on certain vitamins and minerals that we as Americans typically do not get enough of. Vitamin D, calcium, potassium, and iron, along with fiber, have been shown to improve our health and help reduce the risk for certain diseases. So their information is also included on the nutrition label. Iron is listed on the nutrition label because adequate iron intake is important to prevent anemia. We can usually obtain adequate iron intake with lean meats, beans, and iron-fortified foods, such as breakfast cereal. Vitamin D is a new addition to the nutrition label. Previously, the nutrition label included vitamin A and C, but we don't see vitamins A and C listed on the new nutrition label. They were replaced by vitamin D and potassium. And the reason for that is vitamins A and C deficiency are not really an issue in our country, but vitamin D deficiency has become a more important issue to consider. A lot of my patients are taking a vitamin D supplement. Vitamin D is important to help keep our bones strong, and it's necessary for our body to use calcium properly. We can get vitamin D from some dietary sources, including milk. It's been added to milk. Salmon, tuna, and some juices have had vitamin D added as well. Our body has the ability to synthesize vitamin D as well in our skin when our skin is exposed to sunshine. However, as we get older, our skin does lose the ability to produce some of that vitamin D, or if we avoid exposure to the sun because of the risk of skin cancer, that may be limiting our vitamin D production. Dietary sources of vitamin D become even more important in those situations. Calcium has always been included on the nutrition label, and calcium is important for promoting bone health and can reduce the risk for osteoporosis. Dairy products are one of our best sources of calcium. However, if we can't drink milk or other dairy products, almond milk is a great alternative. Some almond milk actually has a little bit more calcium than cow's milk. The calcium has been added to the almond milk. Potassium is included on the nutrition label as well. Potassium is important in regulating fluid balance and muscle contractions and has been shown to help reduce blood pressure levels when consumed in high enough amounts. Potassium is found in many plant foods, including bananas and avocados, our legumes, which are our starchy beans like pinto beans and kidney beans, and it's also found in our spinach and melons and potatoes, as well as milk and some meat products. Dietary fiber is also listed on the nutrition label. Our daily goal is to consume 20 to 35 grams of fiber based on our calorie needs. Adequate fiber can help reduce our risk for cardiovascular disease, help with blood glucose control if we're diabetic, and also help with weight management. Foods high in fiber tend to be very filling. Fiber can also aid in digestion and be helpful in maintaining bowel regularity. Fiber is found in plant foods, so legumes and lentils, fruits and vegetables, and grains. And the more processed the plant food is, the more fiber that is lost during the processing. For example, whole fresh fruit would have the most fiber, where canned fruit would have a little bit less, and fruit juice would have close to no fiber left. So the more unprocessed plant foods we can be eating, the higher our dietary fiber intake. Now that can be a little bit harder to determine when we look at grains, because most of the grains that we eat in our diet have been processed at some point. If we look at loaves of bread, that's an example of a processed grain, but some breads have been processed more heavily than others. So when we're looking at breads, one trick is to actually look at the ingredient list. We want to see the word whole in the first ingredient. So if the first ingredient is 100% whole wheat flour or 100% whole oat flour, that's a whole grain choice. If the first ingredient is enriched wheat flour, that's not the same thing. What enriched means is that the grain has been processed and the bran or the outer layer has been removed along with most of the important nutrients that we find in grains. Now manufacturers enrich the grain, which means they add back some of the nutrients that were lost, but they cannot typically add back fiber easily. So the fiber content tends to be pretty low. The other trick is to actually look at the grams of fiber. We're aiming to have 2 to 3 grams of fiber per serving of bread. That would be a high fiber choice. With breakfast cereals or oatmeal, we would aim to have at least 5 grams of fiber per serving of cereal. That would be considered a high fiber cereal choice. The percentages on the right side of the label are percent daily values. This tells us how much of a particular nutrient that this food provides. So for example, the nutrition label on your slide is a food that provides 25% of your dietary fiber needs for the day. A quick way to use that percent daily value is to realize that if a food provides 5% or less of a particular nutrient, then it's actually low in that nutrient. So on our example, it's low in added sugars. If it's 20% or more, then that food is high in that particular nutrient. So our example here is high in fiber and high in iron and calcium. The percentages can be helpful to compare different food items. One thing to be careful of, the percentages are based on 2,000 calories per day. They're also based on a healthy American, so the saturated fat recommendation is actually higher, and the sodium may be higher than what we're aiming for as a heart patient. For that reason, I don't put a lot of emphasis on the percent daily values. I would rather us actually look at the grams of saturated fat or the milligrams of sodium when we're trying to make our choices. The Nutrition Label Act also regulated what manufacturers can claim on their packaging. So if a manufacturer says that a food is low in saturated fat, there is a specific definition on what that means. It means it has to have less than 1 gram of saturated fat per serving. Low sodium, for example, means 140 milligrams or less of sodium per serving. However, reduced sodium and less sodium means something different. According to the Nutrition Label Act, this simply means at least 25% less sodium than the original version. But if I'm holding reduced sodium lunch meat, my original lunch meat may have had 600 milligrams of sodium in it. So in that case, the reduced sodium product still could have 400 or more milligrams of sodium because it's still achieving that limit of at least 25% less. So it's always a good idea to flip a package over and take a look at the actual nutrition label. Remember, what's printed on the front of a package is marketing. They're trying to sell you a product. And food marketing companies have gotten very clever in the way they phrase things. For example, hint of salt. I see that a lot of times. And honestly, I don't know what that means, and neither do you, because there's no clear definition of what hint of salt means. That's simply the opinion of the manufacturer. Now, it may be low in sodium, and it may not be. The best bet is to flip that package over and take a look at the actual milligrams of sodium listed per serving. We may also see phrases like sugar-free or no sugar added on packaging. These claims are also clearly defined by the nutrition label law. No sugar added simply means that no sugar was added during the processing or packaging of the food. However, the food may contain natural sugars. An example would be a no sugar added ice cream. Still has sugars listed because the milk that was used to make the ice cream had natural sugar in it. Sugar-free products would have no natural sugar or added sugar and less than 5 calories per serving. The percent daily values also help to identify whether a manufacturer can claim that a food is rich in fiber, for example, or an excellent source of calcium. This is clearly defined based on how much of that particular nutrient is provided by the food using the percent daily values. We may have seen some other nutrient claims on products that we're unsure what they mean. For example, gluten-free. We see a variety of products that are labeled as gluten-free. Gluten is a protein that is found in some grains, wheat, rye, and barley, for example. And gluten can cause a problem for many patients. Patients with celiac disease have to strictly avoid gluten, and people with gluten intolerances or sensitivities also avoid gluten. However, many people can tolerate gluten without difficulty. There are also plenty of foods that naturally do not contain gluten. For example, fruits and vegetables and fresh meat don't have any of that grain protein in them. Even the word healthy has been clearly defined by the nutrition label law. A healthy food is a food that is not low in total fat, but has a fat profile of mostly those healthy fats, the mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. Or a food can be labeled as healthy if it contains at least 10% of the daily value of potassium or vitamin D. The word natural currently has no legal definition. We also may see the phrase non-GMO. What does this mean? GMO stands for genetically modified organisms. These are crops that have been modified to become resistant to pests or to certain pesticides and improve their growing ability. There are only a few approved GMO crops in the United States, including squash, corn, soybeans, sugar beets, papaya, apples, and potatoes. And not every variety of these have been genetically modified, but if we're choosing one of these, we may want to look for that non-GMO label. Be aware that other crops should not be genetically modified, even if they aren't labeled as such, because they were never an approved GMO crop to begin with. Now let's take one last look at the original nutrition label compared to the new nutrition label and look at some of the differences that were made with that revision. We've already talked about some of the changes, like the addition of added sugars being identified, and the change from vitamin A and C being listed to now vitamin D and potassium being listed on the nutrition label. Another change that's quite obvious is that the font size increased for both the calories and the serving size listed on the nutrition label. And the reason for this is there has been an increase in the prevalence of obesity in our country. And like we talked about at the beginning, calorie intake is important when it comes to weight management. So by increasing the font size and making it bolder, they're trying to draw the consumer's attention to the actual calorie content of a food, as well as highlighting what an appropriate serving size would be. Now, some of those standardized serving sizes that we talked about actually did increase a little bit with the revision, and that drew some negative criticism. People asked, why are you making portion sizes bigger if we have a problem with obesity? But the reality is there were only a few standardized serving sizes that actually increased, and what they were doing was trying to be more realistic in what someone would actually eat. So for example, in the original label, the standardized serving size of ice cream was a half a cup. With the new label, the standardized serving size of ice cream increased to 2/3 of a cup. In reality, that's a pretty small increase, but will probably more realistically reflect how much ice cream we will actually eat. Another change that we might notice is that we see the actual micrograms and milligrams listed for the vitamins and minerals down at the bottom. On the original label, it simply listed the percent daily values. On the new label, they include the percent daily values along with the actual amounts. And this is helpful if there's a specific amount of calcium that we're aiming for the day, we can know exactly how much is provided by each food. Now remember, some manufacturers will have a little bit more time to make the transition to the new label if they're a smaller manufacturer. So we should be seeing the new label for most foods, and as we continue on, we should see it for all foods.